session, we have excellent speakers continuing around our momentum here. Next up is William Casebeer. He's a project manager with DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. Please help welcome Bill Casebeer.
Turning into that, is this functioning? Okay, great, thank you. Thanks very much for the introduction, John. I appreciate the invitation to speak at the conference, so thank you, Matt. I appreciate it, Wendell. It's been a lovely couple of days. I'm going to pull a little bit of a big switch. So tomorrow was kind enough to mention that I was going to be talking some about the neurobiology of habit formation. And I have briefly prepared that topic, but I realized over the course of the last day that briefing would essentially have been some ungodly love child of what would happen if you combine Bill, Molly, Wendell, and Jay's box. So rather than rehearse some of that ground, I'll give you a 30-second précis of that talk, and then press into a different presentation that Toronto and Jotterand haven't covered yet, just for the purpose of keeping things lively. So the thesis of that presentation was that if we take the risk-utility notions of character development seriously, that at least one thing that character development institutions do is they need to identify the difference between good practice and bad practice of the virtues. And then if we look at neurobiology of moral judgment, we might be able to quantify and understand the context sensitivity of the distinction between good practice and bad practice. And if we do that, we'll find ourselves tending closer to the institutional environment in which moral action takes place, so that we can understand things like why at the military service academies, for instance, a lot of violations of the honor code occur because of the lack of sleep. And then we can insulate people against the effect of those kinds of environmental influences by giving them better time management skills. And that reversely, neurobiology might provide some insight on how to make that process more efficient. So that's that talk. I want to do something. Let's talk about the relationship between neuroethics, broadly construed, and issues in national security, since I think that Jim and I are, Jotterand and I are probably going to be the only ones who will speak to these issues in the conference. And I would argue that neuroscience technology offers lots of promise and lots of peril in the national security domain, and that it cuts across all three individuals pictured here. So the individual to your left is Torek. I took this picture several years ago when I was roaming around the Pan-Sahel region. So this is a region in the central belt of Africa, rugged terrain. This ethnic group has conflicts with the governments of some of the nations in the area, such as that of Mali, with regard to resource distribution. So this gentleman here is going to have to make some decisions. Does he put in his lot with the Alliance for Democratic Change, a foreign group that wants to engage the central government of Mali in a peaceful fashion, so as to foment political change? Or does he put in his lot with a group that used to be called the GSPC? That's the Salafist group for preaching and combat. So you have a love group with a very forthright name like that. It tells you, what we're going to do. We're going to preach to you about the Salafi, the teachings of the Prophet. If you don't like that, we'll kill you. Okay? And that group has since relabeled itself, and they are now called Al-Qaeda in the lands of the Islam Maghreb. So who that disaffected Malian youth throws his lot in with, I would argue, is going to be conditioned by the narratives and stories that respected elders and others, peers as well, whom he interacts with day in and day out. And that some of those narratives and stories are going to influence his neurobiology in ways that affects fundamental moral distinctions he will make, such as whom he thinks it is permissible to kill to achieve a political aim. All right, so neuroscience can offer insights into that process, and may even offer us technologies that we can use to kind of creatively think about that ecology. Here's another individual who will be impacted. This is somebody with the Ohio National Guard who's deployed in Helmand province in Afghanistan in this case. The highest figure I've ever seen with regards to deployed combat forces is that almost 49% of them return with at least pre-clinical symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. I've also seen figures as high as the high 20s for people who have clinical DSM-4 diagnosable symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. So, being downrange, being involved in conflict has psychological impact that neuroscience can help us understand and address. sense that there's a relationship between PTSD and the formation of traumatic memory. And we also know that that formation of the process of forming memory, recalling and consolidating it, takes place in a temporally extended fashion, such that within the first 24 hours it might be possible to design an intervention that prevents the migration of AMPA receptors that have to kind of move up the axon of a neuron and make their way up the synaptic cleft so as to be able to affiliate the experience to lay down the memory. If we can disrupt that process, perhaps we could, in a sense, immunize soldiers against some aspects of post-traumatic stress disorder. That's at least a possibility. On the flip side, we might also be able to give the soldier a neuroscience-oriented technology that lets them deal with the dramatic amounts of information they have to process in order to be able to carry out their mission. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Finally, this individual also is going to be impacted by neuroscience technology. So this baby is an MAOA mutant. So what that means is that on the tail end of the Y chromosome for this young male boy, there was a mistake in crossover such that a segment of the genome that codes for the production of monoamine oxidase A has been deleted. And it turns out that MAOA is a critical chemical that lets you use an enzyme that codes for a set of chemical reactions that help you catalyze serotonin, right? It eats serotonin in the brain. So if you are an MAOA mutant, you may have problems catalyzing serotonin, and as a result, depending on the distribution of serotonin receptors in the brain, you can have pathologies that come from being unable to regulate serotonin, something that Molly will talk a lot more about. One thing I would point out about this baby, so you can immediately think, of course, the therapeutic-oriented interventions that might prevent MAOA mutants from constituting the majority of the criminals in the California prison system, for instance. I know that empirical findings available, but nonetheless, aside from those therapeutic interventions, there are also larger public policy upshot that comes from thinking about the epigenomic interactions that influence the expression of the gene. So neuroscience-oriented technologies aren't just about developing pills or liquids or augmenting technologies. They may also help you design an ecosystem that might prevent the expression of neurobiologically important genes. And John Cacioppo has done some lovely work, for instance, where he's shown these interesting interaction effects between critical breakpoints in your development as a child and the expression of the MAOA gene. So in other words, it's not sufficient that you merely possess the chopped off tail end of the Y chromosome, but also you have to be able to use it at certain points in your development. And we might be able to squeeze public policy advice, pay special attention. I mean, of course, we should always be concerned about child abuse, but pay special attention to it in these cases because of its downstream epigenomic effects that are neuroscientifically salient. So what I'll quickly do for about the next 13 or 14 minutes is give you some definitions of neuroethics to help set the stage for this discussion. I want to talk about the links between between a neuroscience-oriented national security technology and the radicalization process. That will lead to a brief discussion of just war theory, which is a tool we have in our applied ethics toolkit that we use to regulate the application of force in the battlefield. And I want to argue that because of its connection to traditional ethical principles, we might also be able to use some of those same questions to help us regulate the application of neuroscience-related technologies in the battlefield. Now, even so, there are still lots of concerns presented by the changing context of the battlefield, and I'll briefly address those. At the end of the day, my position here is a pragmatic one. I want to comfort the afflicted, right? Those who foresee some type of Borgesian or Morwickian disaster coming about because of the use of neuroscience in the security domain. But I also want to afflict the comfortable by pointing out some of the problematic considerations that arise. Ultimately, I'm an optimist, and I want to convince you that you should be too, or at least that's not crazy to be an optimist in the face of this technology. So here's some preliminaries. First of all, what we mean by ethics. This is a sophisticated audience, so I don't need to spend much time in these next 2 or 3 slides. Some in light of science and norms in a weak sense, an organized body of knowledge about what we have to do or think or about what kind of people we ought to be. That's normally captured by the big 3 moral theories that you hear about in any survey course. So for neuroscientists or engineers among you, right, you may have had to suffer through an ethics course in your undergraduate of education, and you almost certainly talked about virtue theory, deontology, utility. The first day and a half of the conference were really focused on Kant here as an exemplar and Mill as an exemplar here, even though a lot of the speakers did start by talking about Aristotle and Plato. We didn't get too much normative versus with them initially. It seemed like I'm very happy to see that we turn that corner today. And see the usefulness of virtue theory helping us think about neuroethics. So really all the big free moral theories do is capture our intuitions that many morally problematic situations. There are three angles of analysis that you can bring to bear. Namely, that you have an agent doing something that has certain effects, and we can evaluate all three of those slices. The agent, virtue theoretic concerns, the thing that is done, the structure of the action, doing something, and finally the effects of the action, the utility of the action. Now, in the neuroethics literature, there are normally three senses that we talk about. We talk about the application of neuroscience to a problem. So it's really a question of applied ethics that the bioethicists among us are extremely well qualified to practice. And there are also interesting relationships between neuroscience and moral reasoning that might give us insight into the epistemology of morality, how to come to know moral facts, are there such a thing as moral facts, and the ontology of morality. Are the entities posited as parts of, say, our moral psychology by the various moral theories that they actually exist? So, neuroethics then is a systematic study of how the topics of neurosciences interact with, in our case today, especially applied ethics, moral epistemology, and moral ontology to produce innovations in all three fields. I today want to dwell on the applied ethics aspects and the national security sense. The actions we take individually and collectively to defend ourselves, and I'm fully aware that we there is a loaded term and genuflect and Foucault and Derrida's directions. I mean, I understand that we have political issues we need to resolve here. Don't read too much into this. All right, now I want to drive home the importance of neuroscience for helping us understand security issues by looking at, in part, the radicalization process. So here's a case study for you. The process that turns an individual into a member of an armed, non-state organization usually involves inputs, things like resource scarcity, demographic pressures, the presence of organized crime and corruption, and identity cleavages, that is, splits between in-groups and out-groups that can be exploited, usually by an identity entrepreneur, somebody who takes these inputs and acts on them so as to mobilize the given population. There are also failures of governance that often result whenever a newly constituted government fails to discharge its duties to its citizens. And those two things can feed those inputs to eventually produce some kind of violent non-state organization. Of course, the loop doesn't stop then. There are reinforcing actions that both the nation organization and the nation state take. These are explored in the popular literature and things like the movie for Vendetta, right, based on the Alan Moore comic book, which very nicely details the process of the mobilization of a violent social movement in the face of heavy-handed crackdowns by not very nice governments. All I want to point out is that this systemic process is shot through concerns that cognitive neuroscience can shed light on, ranging from the impact of our environment, resource scarcity, on the mechanisms that we use to reason about who is a member of our group and who isn't, whom we can harm and whom we can't, demographic pressures that may lead to radical changes in identity cleavages, for instance. So if we look at the radicalization problem, it generally doesn't stem from a relatively well-constituted polity. It generally stems from diaspora communities who find themselves dislocated and separated from traditional mechanisms of cultural support, especially second-generation members of some of those diaspora communities. And all of these processes, I would also argue, we can get insight into how they occur by examining cognitive neuroscience. So maybe even something as deep as identity, how something like a narrative or a story influences identity would be a critical subject of concern. And to motivate that, I think all we have to do is gesture back to Josh Green's presentation from 2 days ago. This is from Green's original paper in Science in 2001, where he did his first very well-known experiments in the trolley versus footbridge problem. I won't rehearse this again, since you all know well. I'm just going to point out one thing, that the difference between personal and impersonal moral scenarios is a difference in narrative, right? 3 or 4 sentences that deliver to you a different story that activate radically different neural structures, some implicated in working memory, and hence which incline you toward consequential reasoning, and others which implicate emotional regions, theory of mind-oriented regions, which push you towards thinking about the interpersonal nature right? Stories influence the mechanisms you bring online to make a moral judgment, and in this case, it's a fundamental moral judgment. Whom do you have permission to kill? All right, so you can see why, just a foot stomp, why I think Green's work is illustrative here about the importance of stories for influencing moral judgment. That's important for national security. Now, if we're going to systematically study then how stories might influence things like moral judgment, we need a theory of story. So here's one. This comes from Gustav Freytag, a 19th century German writer. He regurgitated and warned over Aristotle from the Poetics, who said that stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. A setup that rises to a climax, that relaxes to a resolution, usually involves a struggle between a protagonist and an antagonist, where the protagonist is normally an in-group member and the antagonist is normally an out-group member. In fact, if you look at hyperactive political tropes in propaganda, for instance, they embody Freytag triangle-style structures. For example, a comprehensive examination of television commercials on Hezbollah's TV station Al-Manar reveals that they have interesting setup, climax, resolution style tendencies. There's one that shows the events of the early 1930s and 1940s, and it tells you neo-colonial powers unjustifiably established the state of Israel. The climax of the commercial is we, the Palestinians, resist violently, and the resolution of the commercial is Israel is pushed to the sea in the 21st century. That 3 to 4 sentence story does a lot for you in your cognitive economy. It tells you who you want to empathize with, who you want not to empathize with. It suggests certain fixed action patterns that you might use in a struggle against the oppression that's been done to you, and it frames the environment in which you swim in terms of a justice-oriented issue. Look at what the outgroup members have done to us. The only way you can respond with violence. And so we see some of these tropes and themes reflected even in other things. For instance, I took this photograph outside of the Imam Mosque in Bamako. So this is seen by about 20,000 people each day as they go into the mosque to worship. And I know my photography is bad. Does anybody recognize this scene? It was actually an Atlantic article about this scene. This is Muhammad al-Dura and his father. And in 2001, Muhammad al-Dura was a Palestinian youth who was shot, some say, by the Israeli Defense Forces unjustifiably. Right? So this is a touchstone story for Palestinian resistance. There's no caption. All it is a single still, a visual image that immediately suggests for audiences who are familiar with the story whom they ought to be empathizing with here, Muhammad al-Dura and his father, even though there is no real connection culturally between the peoples of West Africa and the Palestinians. So there's sort of a consciousness being developed here that I would argue is being bridged by a story or narrative. Now, as we turn then to think about what kind of neuroscience-oriented technologies we can develop to help us think about the radicalization process and how we disrupt it, there might be some alarm bells that are going off in your head, right? And justifiably so, right? We need to tread cautiously on this type of ground. But as we do this, we aren't at sea in a sieve. Okay, we have some resources in our toolkit. I would open up the applied ethics toolbox, grab out a screwdriver, a wrench, and so on. And in this case, I would start at least here, just work here. Are traditional tools that we use to evaluate when I can apply certain tools on the battlefield. And of course, we split justice war consideration between use ad hoc and justice at the war itself. Here's the traditional questions we asked. And use in bello, that is the actions that we take inside of the war, whether those can be justified. And if you look down this list, a lot of these questions and tests advert to the traditional questions, the big three moral theories that I talked about earlier, advert to. So in a sense, all we're doing is revisiting in an applied scenario those three major moral theories, except we're using them to guide questions we have about use of force in the battlefield. So we can ask not just about use of force in the battlefield, but about other technologies in the battlefield as well. How they fare against those kind of big three tools that resulted in the screwdriver, wrench, and so on being in our toolbox. So I think we keep in mind the 3 C's, in other words. Character, consent, and consequence. That's how I capture, in an amateurish fashion, the types of questions we need to ask about a neuroscience-related technology. Does using the technology make us less functional as human beings, or would it have us develop bad character traits? So virtues and vices are canonical here. On the Kantian front, consent. Does the subject of the technology consent, and I know that's a good term, implicit, explicit consent, and so on, to having it used? Rights and duties are paramount considerations here. And finally, consequence. Do the good consequences of using the technology outweigh the bad consequences? This is just a straightforward regurgitation of Miller's greatest happiness principles. So these 3 C's capture a lot of the moral concerns we might have about applying a neuroscience tutor technology on the biologized battlefield. Sometimes they do provide us a tool for resolution. We'll find they all agree, right? And they all tell you ought not to take a particular action with no use of a particular technology. In other cases, they won't, and we'll have tough moral reasoning to do. Now, keep in mind that as we apply these tools to the biologized battlefield, there are some differences between new warfare and old warfare, between mechanized industrial warfare and, say, the types of counterinsurgency operations that are being conducted in Afghanistan and Iraq. Here are some of them. First of all, the combatant and non-combatant distinction has become even more problematized. It's oftentimes difficult for our soldiers to tell who's legally constituted combatant and who isn't. Moreover, the decisions they have to make have been accelerated. So, Colonel John Boyd articulated this thing called OODA loop. You observe, orient, decide, and act in a particular circumstance, and if you can do that faster than your adversary, then you'll probably prevail on the battlefield. But the OODA loop for a contemporary soldier has been accelerated. That in turn boosts the chances of unintended consequences and complicates appropriate force questions. So life on the 21st century battlefield is going to be more complicated as a result. But these differences are ones of degree, not of time. This isn't a radical change in terms of the nature of warfare. So what I'll end up in my last minute and a half of my presentation is just to briefly address some generic concerns you might have about national security or in neuroscience technologies and some responses and considerations. You may say, hey, in the empirical front, these things are going to reduce human flourishing. For example, what about memory medication? So you mentioned the use of therapeutic that might help prevent PTSD. Might that also have unintended downstream consequences for the natural, quote-unquote, mechanisms we use otherwise to cope with traumatic experience? And that is certainly something we need to keep in mind. You can picture something like a Warwickian disaster occurring. Kevin Warwick was a gentleman from the UK who augmented his body with biological apparatus, implanted sensors in his arm, door his house, and so on. And you could extend this into a cyber-like realm that ought to give us pause with regards to the character concepts. Their nature is so radically changed that they're no longer recognizably human. On the consent front, you may worry that we might be dehumanized by the use of these technologies, especially when we're used without the consent of those affected. And I think we have only examples of this in the neuromarketing side of the house, where Brighthouse Neuromarketing and others are using neuroscience to tutor the efficacy of messages that are delivered less than commercials. And we have justifiable concerns about additives to the brain manipulation, if you will. And those might eventually cause something like the Burgessian disasters. And that's just a reference to Clockwork Orange, which you saw earlier. And finally, on the consequence side, hey, we may lose net pain by using these. Maybe we'll make it more and more likely as a result. Will there not be unintended consequences of something like a pain management technology that our soldiers have taught? You can even imagine a scenario where this is wrapped around a nanotechnology where you have a reproduction issue such that at the end of the day you have some catastrophic breakthrough disaster. So the entire surface of the earth is covered in a devastating feet with an out-of-control nanotechnology. So I just want you to keep in mind that all those scenarios in the far right are all fictional. Right? None of them happened yet. Perhaps with the exception of climate change, I would argue that our organizations are generally adapting enough that they likely will happen. Also keep in mind these facts, that we are manipulating those neural states, and I don't mean that in a nefarious sense, at multiple entry points and multiple scales. So my appearance results in a change of state for you. The way I present myself results in a change of state. If I touch you for more than 15 seconds, endogenous oxytocin production will go up in your brain, and that will result in modulation of trust-related judgments and so on. So again, differences of degree, not of time. And moreover, in an adversarial situation where other nation states and other non-state entities might be researching this exact same science, if we're to defend ourselves against intrusions into our autonomy, we need an understanding of the basic mechanisms responsible for influence and how those are incorporated into the brain. Restraint itself does sometimes pose strategic risks in a competitive environment. And so, for that that reason, the precautionary principle itself, while generally praiseworthy in biomedical context, is not without risk in a competitive security environment. None of this is to say that we shouldn't have democratic oversight of these technologies in the battlefield, and that we might even have internationally constituted democratic oversight of these technologies. Don't have time to get into that today. I just want to point out that we do need oversight, and that no set of choices is without risk, especially with regard to making our institutions accountable.
Our next speaker is Fabrice Jotterand. He comes to us from Southwestern Medical Center, University of Texas.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great conference, and it's really a pleasure to talk about psychopathy. And I want you to keep in mind this is a work in progress. There are some issues about psychopathy just in the psychiatry literature now with the DSM-5. I think the DSM-4 doesn't include psychopathy as an entry in the DSM-5. If you go online, you'll find it under antisocial personality disorder. Most of you will recognize this face, the Joker in Batman. And the title is Enhancing Criminal Brains. And I wanted to be ambiguous in my talk, in my title, and hopefully not in the talk. The reason is because I can't remember this morning somebody raised a question about criminals wanting to have access to this technology. Because if you have psychopathic tendencies, you might want to fit in society and still, be a criminal, engage in criminal activity. So here, are we enhancing the brain of criminals so they can become better people and fit in society and treat them, or do we want to use that technology for these individuals to become better criminals? So I want to, in terms of my title, this is what I wanted to do. And this is why I'm just raising questions. And obviously, in 20 minutes, I'm going to be able only to scratch the surface about the issues we need to address. So I want to talk a little bit about defining psychopathy. Just for some of you might not we know what a psychopath is, but we need to have a better understanding than just this kind of what the media or popular culture will tell us. Then talk a little bit about the neurobiology of psychopathy, because I was the reason why I got interested in psychopathy is because actually I wrote an article criticizing Jay's notion of virtue ethics. That came out last year in Age of Neuroscience, because I thought, how can we engineer virtues? And I was a little bit skeptic, and I'm still a skeptic, but I don't want to be a skeptic like Buchanan would say, the anti enhancement and all the debate he has in his book. But I was puzzled because, obviously everybody wants to improve society, and we want to be better people. And some people might not be able to do so because of particular conditions. And I thought psychopathy is one of them. So, I'm sympathetic with his work in the idea of, having a better society. But when we talk about virtue engineering, are we talking about morality, or are we talking about controlling the behavior of people? And so this will be my critique of moral enhancement. I think we need clarity in terms of what we mean by morality. And then, then I said, well, okay, it might not be morality, but we could control the behavior of certain individuals. And so I look at what can we do. So I look at psychopharmacology, and then the fMRI brain-computer interface they're developing in Tübingen with Birnbaumer And so I thought, oh, this is very interesting. So I don't want to say, no, we shouldn't develop, it's not possible. I think, yes, we can use that technology. But it's, again, it's not to enhance the morality. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the ethical and social implications if we develop these technologies. And here I'm going to raise the questions. I'm not going to give an analysis of these questions. So if we look at prior accounts of psychopathy, we see that people tend to define various scholars, they call it derangements of the moral faculties or moral insanity. So it's very appealing to me just to investigate these notions. Well, moral insanity was this moral disease concept that you addressed. But the current definition is, well, psychopathy is a personality disorder characterized by emotional dysfunction, the inability to have empathy, and antisocial behavior. And then when we look at some statistics, 1 to 2% of the general population is considered has psychopathic traits or is a psychopath. Interestingly, 3.5% of businessmen are considered or have psychopathic traits. But what's key here to remind ourselves is that not all psychopaths are necessarily criminals. So this is why, for me, it's very interesting from a social standpoint. Because if we have true psychopath in society, then the question is, do we have a moral obligation to develop these technology or use the technology available to prevent, treat, diagnose psychopathy in society? We know what happened in Norway, 9/11, and I'm not saying these people are necessarily psychopaths, but do we want to avoid this type of behavior in society and have a better society in general, more people in our society? Now, if we look at treatment, well, so far we're not very successful to treat psychopathy. Pharmacology doesn't help much. Behavioral therapy has a higher rate of recidivism. So that's why I was interested. If there is no treatment, well, maybe psychopharmacology and brain-computer interface might help. And then if you look at the prison population, 15% of male prison individuals are criminal. Criminal psychopaths constitute 15% of male prison population, but these individuals commit 50% more crime than non-psychopathic inmates. So again, here we see that there is a certain utility to develop these technologies, but again, how do we go about in developing these technologies? Now, if you look at the profile of psychopathic individuals, so you look at their, in terms of affective outlook, shallow affects, lack of empathy, lack of remorse, interpersonal, grandiose sense of self-worth, and so forth. But what's very interesting is these people are very charming. Ted Bundy was a law student. Very, very charming. So it's very difficult to detect them. It's very difficult to say, because these individuals have a particular role. So what you see in their cognitive functions are okay. It's the emotional dimension of their personality that is affected. And I'm going to show you some slides about that. Now, if you look at the neurobiology of basis of psychopathy, it's about neuroanatomy, some dysfunction in brain structure, but it's also about genetics and going back to the checklist. So I think we need to merge the three components to really define if an individual is psychopathic. The danger of using neuroimaging, for example, is to reduce an individual just to what you see in an image, and then the questions about interpretation and so forth. But I'm not going to go that route. But if you look at various studies, for example, and I didn't mention the references, but I could if you're interested. But damage to the orbital frontal cortex can affect affective and cognitive processes essential for moral deliberation. Damage to the anterior cingulate affected capacity for empathy. This is a big one for psychopathic individuals. And then damage to the amygdala creates difficulties processing various affective stimuli, such as the inability to recognize anger and fear in the face of others. Key here, a psychopath, I mean, if you're suffering, they really don't care. They will not be able to recognize the signals in your face that you're in distress or you're fearful. So here, what I wanted to show you, and again here, I don't want to discuss necessarily these slides, but just to show you, based on the study by Rain and Young, these are the regions most commonly activated in moral judgment in normal individuals. So you have the amygdala and the gyrus and the cingulate and so forth. I understand that the way the brain functions is very complicated. But I want to be able to just make sure that we point to certain parts of the brain, because as we will see in the next slides, certain brain regions are functionally and structurally impaired in antisocial, violent, and psychopathic individuals. And you see there is an overlap between these regions, especially these here, if we go back and forth. And then Rain in his study showed that if you look at the yellow, these are regions common to both antisocial behavior and mental decision-making capacity. So you see that there is an overlap. And this, for me, was very interesting, because if you look at the way the brain functions in terms of our capacity to make decisions, and the regions affected in psychopathic individuals, you see some overlap. So, and then genetics, as I mentioned, it's the last one, but again, I'm not going to talk too much about that. So, development of treatment options. So, where do we go from there? And so I got interested way back, 2 years back, I was interested in the brain-computer interface. But it was more about bionic arms and these type of questions. But then I came across this fMRI brain-computer interface developed in Germany, in Tübingen, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about it. And then also psychopharmacology. These are the two that I wanted to talk about. So then we talked about this fMRI brain-computer interface. And here I'm referring to an article by Wim Bauer and colleagues from 2002. And they did a study on criminal psychopath. And what they determined is that there is a deficit in metabolic activity in the fear circuit, which is important for behavioral development. So the idea to use this technology, this fMRI brain computer, is to train, or they want these individuals to learn how to reactivate brain regions implicated in fear conditioning. Now, we could talk about, the technology itself, but I would have to do that more with a neuroscientist to have a really better understanding, and I'm not going to do that. But so they did a little study, and so they had 9 healthy subjects, and they wanted to measure the bold effect, so the vascular response to neuroactivity. And they had 3 sessions of 20 minutes. And what they managed to do, and here we see an increase in bold activity, and here we see also the brains, and we see that this was session 3, and session 1 nothing, and then in session 3 you see that they increased the bold activity. So the idea is to use the same technology. In the article, they refer to 3 psychopathic individuals where you see that there is an increase activity in the brain. So I didn't want to talk about it because it's the way they put it. It was not very clear whether only 3. I mean, it's statistically not very relevant. So I want to avoid that discussion. But the idea, I mean, if you have 9 healthy subjects, it should work, and so they're developing that technology. Okay, let me move a little bit faster here. Then SSRI, in terms of psychopharmacology, there is this study in 2011, came out last year, the effects of sertraline on psychopathic traits. And so the study examined whether sertraline alters psychopathic personality traits in patients with major depressive disorder. I'm not going to talk about the method, just they have a regimen of the SSRI, and then also they have the self-reporting instrument, the psychopathic personality inventory. But the findings are very interesting that SSRI may enhance adaptive psychopathic personality traits such as social charm, which is a trait of psychopath, and interpersonal boldness. SSRIs may reduce maladaptive psychopathic personality traits such as impulsivity and externalization of blame. So these would help criminal psychopaths just to fit into society. But it would help, I mean, if we treat these individuals to remove some of their psychopathic traits. So I find this very interesting, and again, some people at this conference talked about SSRI, so I'm not going to go further into this. So does this study show that we can improve and enhance moral behavior? And I would say no. It would, in my view, it enhances behavior. It controls behavior, but not moral behavior. And I'm going to provide 3 critiques. The first one, I think, it's a misconception of moral psychology. The second one is there's a threat to the very essence of moral agency, what it means to be a moral agent, and then the wrong assumptions about moral neutrality. So the first one is about moral judgment, the second one is about autonomy, and the third one about moral content. So let me move to the first one. If we look at the structure of human moral behavior, we see that our emotions are involved, our volition and our reasoning are involved. So we have affective, motivational, and cognitive processes. When you put the 2 together, more emotions and more reasoning, then we have more judgments. I think what the technology, at least so far, has done, we have emphasized more emotions. I mean, the effect on more emotions. This is why I'm saying that I think we're not enhancing moral behavior, but more we're trying to control behavior. So this is historically goes back to Hume and Kant on the role of reason and emotions in morality. But I think we should not see them as being opposed, but rather as working in synergy and influencing each other. And here, this is my colleague, psychiatrist John Sadler. He came up with this distinction between moral capacity and moral content. So moral capacity is the ability to respond morally. It's about our affection, our more emotions. So our more emotions will determine how we behave and how we respond to a moral dilemma. But then you need more content. And more content is what is a point of reference in the way we're going to behave. It's not just the way we behave, it's not just a question of reacting to certain emotions, but these emotions are structured or influenced by more content. And I think some of you raised the question about the content of morality. It's not just a question of capacity. So if we go back, then the reason why I'm skeptic about this notion of moral enhancement is because this part here, I don't see where the content of morality comes. And I haven't seen anything in the literature showing that we can really influence more reasoning or the content of morality. So then the second critique, the threat to the very essence of moral agency, for 1 minute. Okay, I need to go. Quick. Well, it's really about autonomy. So if these technologies influence our moral behavior, but then what about the role of moral deliberation? And this goes back to virtue ethics and the role of moral reasoning. And so it's a question about morality. And here there is a quote, but I'm not going to read it for the sake of time and move forward. And then the third one is the wrong assumption about moral neutrality, that is moral content. I think in the discussions of what I've read about moral enhancement is the lack of this idea that morality is neutral, that there is no content. But as I point out here, we all come from a different background. I'm from Switzerland. I'm a European. I have different assumptions about, let me just a typical case when we compare Europeans and Americans. Americans tend to be more individualistic. Europeans tend to be more communal. And I've been here for 16 years, and I see these differences. And I think we need to include these concepts in our reflection. We don't live in a vacuum, in a moral vacuum, but we come, if you're a religious person, non-religious, if you're a Kantian, and so forth, and so we need to consider that. Stop. Okay, let me, can I have one more minute? Of course. Okay, thank you. So the task I have of us, I think we see this technology, but we need to anticipate. We need to be proactive and not just say, okay, we're going to develop these technologies and then we're going to stop and scratch our head and say, oh, what have we done? We need to be more proactive in the way we discuss these issues. Ethical issues quickly. I think we need to determine and establish ethical boundaries to enforce the use of these neurotechnology. If we think as a society we have a moral duty and a legal obligation to intervene. And then we need to establish thresholds. How much and what kind of psychopathic traits can or should society tolerate? When is it too much? Maybe some people are eccentric. Maybe they have some, they don't share our moral values. But to what extent, where do we draw the line and say, that's it, now we need to stop and intervene? We have this technology, we're going to do it. And then the question of moral and criminal responsibility. And here there is a debate about whether these individuals, psychopaths, are criminally responsible, deserving punishment and treatment, or whether these individuals are blameless offenders. They just need treatment because they don't understand what they're doing. And then from a societal standpoint, I mentioned the moral obligation and legal duty to protect citizens and how we're going to go about if we have that technology. And then, of course, criminal profiling. Unintended consequences. I raised that question with Jay a few days ago. He came after me, and I couldn't respond. It was on a radio show, but it was very interesting, but I still think it's an important question. I'm not saying we shouldn't develop that technology, but we have to think about who's going to have access to that technology and for what purpose. And I think this is my last slide. So I think in our reflection, we need to think about more emotion and more reasoning and how the two work in synergy and how we could, if we could provide content to morality, how the two could be in some ways implemented through technology. I'm still very skeptic. So it's really about the manipulation of more emotions. And here, in my view, morality, at least at this point, unless I see some evidence, is not engineered or developed. And obviously, we need to develop a vision of the good life and understanding of what it means to flourish as a human being. So, thank you.